My boss banned overtime to save money on his year-end bonus. 3 days later, a $12 million client sat in our lobby for 2 hours because nobody was allowed to stay late and finish the paperwork. I watched it happen from my desk and I did not lift a finger, because for once in my life I was following the rules exactly the way I was told to. My name is Derek and I worked as a logistics coordinator for a shipping company called Halbrook Freight in Ohio. My manager was a man named Roy Kessler, the kind of guy who wore a $1,500 watch but complained about the cost of printer paper. Roy had been passed over for a regional director position twice and he blamed everyone but himself. So when the new fiscal year started, Roy decided the fastest way to look good on paper was to cut overtime costs to zero. Not reduce it? Zero. He called a mandatory meeting on a Monday morning and stood in front of the whiteboard like he was announcing a cure for cancer. Effective immediately, he said, no employee is permitted to work past 5:30. Anyone caught clocking in overtime without written pre-approval from me personally will be written up. No exceptions. He looked right at me when he said it, because I was the one who usually stayed late finishing shipment manifests for our biggest accounts. I raised my hand and asked what happens if a shipment is still processing at 5:30. Roy smiled the smile he always used right before he said something stupid. Then it waits until tomorrow, he said. The client can wait. Nobody in this building is that important. I wrote that down. Word for word. Because I had learned a long time ago that when a manager hands you a rope that's stupid, you do not argue with him. You hand it right back and let him tie the knot himself. For the first 2 weeks, nothing dramatic happened. Small stuff. A few late shipment confirmations that used to go out at 7 now went out at 9 the next morning. A driver waited an extra hour at the loading dock because nobody could finalize his manifest after 5:30. A warehouse supervisor asked me if this was really how things were going to work now, and I just shrugged and said I was only doing what I was told. Roy did not notice any of it because Roy left at 5 every day too, feeling proud of himself for saving the company 40% on our overtime budget. He even sent an email to upper management bragging about it, copying the regional director he was trying to impress, calling it a lean efficiency initiative. He used that exact phrase, lean efficiency initiative, like he had invented something groundbreaking instead of just telling people to go home. A few co-workers started quietly doing the same thing I was doing. If a task was not done by 5:30, it simply did not get done that day. Nobody broke any rules. Nobody complained out loud. We all just did precisely what Roy asked, no more and no less, and we let the consequences pile up exactly where they belonged, on his desk. Then came the Prescott account. Prescott Manufacturing was our biggest client, worth just over $12 million a year in contracted freight volume. Every quarter they sent a compliance auditor to walk through our facility and review our on-time delivery paperwork before renewing the contract. That Thursday, the Prescott auditor, a sharp woman named Linda Voss, arrived at 4:15 in the afternoon expecting to review 3 shipment batches that were supposed to be finalized and signed off before her visit. 2 of the 3 batches were sitting half-processed in my queue because I had gotten them at 4:45, an hour I would normally have stayed to finish before 5:30. Under the new rule, anything not completed by 5:30 had to wait until the next business day. I told Linda exactly that. I am so sorry, I said, but company policy does not allow me to work past 5:30 without written approval from my manager, and he already left for the day. Linda blinked at me like I had spoken a foreign language. She said she had flown in from Chicago specifically for this audit and her flight back was at 7 the next morning. She asked if there was anyone else who could help. I said Roy was the only person authorized to approve overtime and he was unreachable. That part was true. Roy never answered his phone after 5 because he said work-life balance was important to him now that he did not have to worry about overtime costs anymore. Linda sat in our lobby for 2 hours calling her own boss, clearly furious, while I packed up my things at 5:30 exactly, the way policy required. I felt bad for about 4 seconds. Then I remembered Roy standing at that whiteboard telling a room full of people that no client was that important. The next morning Roy walked in at 9 to find 3 voicemails from the regional director, an email from Prescott's legal department threatening to invoke a contract clause about delivery documentation delays, and Linda Voss sitting in the conference room with her arms crossed, having stayed overnight at a hotel on the company's dime because Halbrook's own emergency contact protocol failed her. Roy tried to blame me first. He asked why I did not just stay and finish the batches. I told him, calmly, that I was simply following the policy he announced in the meeting, the one he made me write down, the one he sent in an email to the whole department confirming that no employee may work past 5:30 without his personal written approval. I even had the email pulled up on my screen. I asked him if he wanted me to forward it to Linda so she could see the policy in writing, since her company would probably want documentation for their own file on the incident. Roy went completely pale in that instant. He knew what that meant for him. If Prescott's legal team saw that Halbrook had a formal policy actively preventing staff from completing contracted deliverables on time, it would not look like an isolated mistake. It would look like corporate policy failure, which was a much bigger problem for a $12 million contract renewal. The regional director, a woman named Patricia Hale, arrived by 10 that morning after driving in from Columbus. She pulled Roy into his own office and closed the door, but the walls at Halbrook were thin enough that half the department heard exactly how that conversation went. Patricia wanted to know who approved a blanket ban on overtime without running it through corporate policy review, since anything affecting client-facing deliverables required sign-off above manager level. Roy stammered that he was just trying to control costs. Patricia asked him if he understood what almost losing Prescott would have cost compared to whatever he saved on overtime pay. The number, when she said it, made the whole room go quiet. By lunchtime, Roy sent a company-wide email reversing the overtime policy completely, though he tried to frame it as a temporary pause for review rather than admitting he had been wrong. Nobody believed that framing for a second, but nobody said anything either, because we all understood how this worked now. Linda Voss finished her audit that afternoon once I was finally allowed to complete the paperwork. She told me privately, on her way out, that she respected how professionally I had handled an obviously frustrating situation. She said companies rise or fall based on whether their internal rules actually make sense, and Halbrook clearly had some serious internal contradictions to work out. Prescott ended up renewing the contract, but only after negotiating a penalty clause tied specifically to documentation delays, a clause that Roy now had to personally justify every quarter in front of Patricia. 2 weeks later, Roy called me into his office. He did not apologize directly, because men like Roy rarely do, but he asked if I would be willing to take on a new title as Senior Compliance Coordinator, with a raise and the authority to approve my own overtime without needing his sign-off anymore. He mumbled something about how he always thought I had potential, which was news to me since he had never said a single kind word to me in the 2 years I worked under him. I said yes, obviously. I was not about to turn down a raise just because the apology behind it was clumsy and half-hearted. Some victories do not need a perfect ending. They just need to be real. The overtime ban was never mentioned again. Roy still wears his $1,500 watch and still complains about printer paper, but he checks with corporate now before announcing any policy that touches client deliverables. And every time a new employee starts at Halbrook, someone always tells them the story about the day the boss banned overtime and lost a $12 million client for 2 hours, all because one guy simply did exactly what he was told.